What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to another edition of the Jays for Days podcast. I'm Josh. He is not Josh. Well, he is Josh. He's just not here. He's not here. Josh had to work. He's putting work in. So that's what happened. Josh is not here for this podcast, but he will be back very soon. Do not worry. On the pod today, it's the final conference specific preview of our preseason build up to the college basketball season. We've done SEC, ACC, Pac 12, Big 12, Big 10, Big East. We've done it all, both Josh and I previewing and having conversations with those who cover the conference even more closely than we do. On today's pod is Jordan Guskey. Jordan is the Kansas athletics beat writer for the Topeka Capital-Journal in Lawrence. He covers all Kansas sports, but of course under that umbrella is Bill Self's Jayhawks, led by Hunter Dickinson, DeJuan Harris, KJ Adams. It's a loaded roster, and we had him on to talk Kansas as well as the rest of the Big 12. We get into all of it, the newcomers, Houston, national title contenders, the depth of this conference, and just everything about the epitome of a college basketball conference the last decade or so. So, without further ado, let's go chat with Jordan about Kansas and the rest of the Big 12. Joining me now from the Topeka Capital-Journal, covering all of Kansas athletics, but that under that umbrella falls the Kansas men's basketball program, Jordan Guskey, at Jordan Guskey on Twitter. Jordan, thanks so much for taking the time this morning. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, man. How are you?
I'm doing well. Eventful last 4 weeks or so in your neck of the woods in Lawrence. 4 weeks ago, we have Arturo Morris dismissed from the program after the legal trouble that he has been in. 2 weeks ago, Kansas avoids major consequences after the IARP investigation. And then a week ago, on a completely different note, Kansas kind of the runaway pick for the number one team in the preseason AP poll. So eventful 4 weeks or so in Lawrence for a program across all ends of the spectrum. What's the vibe in Lawrence around the program right now? Is there some lingering stuff from what's happened the last few weeks, or are we very much, this could be a special team, number one AP preseason, and we're just ready to get the season going?
Yeah, I think as things get closer to the season opener, and especially with a couple exhibitions coming up in the next week, I think the trajectory of positivity is still going up. Like you mentioned with the preseason number one, preseason Big 12 favorite. They got 3 different preseason All Big 12 guys, and Hunter, Kevin, and Juan. So yeah, there have definitely been some negative stuff that's happened. Even though they, like you mentioned, they avoided major penalties, it's still not a great a great thing if you're getting penalized for different things. But they definitely, like you said, got out of it without really major stuff going on. But I think the positivity is really trending on an upward sort of slope here. And I don't think that's going to stop really anytime soon.
Yeah, lots of reasons on the basketball court to be excited. The preseason accolades are there pretty much everywhere you look, as you mentioned. And on paper, it's a team that is really special, and it has some names that really jump off the page. Real quick before we kind of get into the rest of that, I kind of connected to Arturo Morris's dismissal. I think, right, of course, we all have read and seen the reasons for it and his legal trouble, but on the basketball court, I think it's, that was a guy that was going to be a part of the backcourt depth for Bill Self's team this year, right? Doesn't jump off the page from what he did last year at Texas, playing only 11 minutes a game, but that is a former 5-star guy, a former really highly ranked recruit. What do you think is the on-court trickle-down effect from him leaving the program, whether it's guys, that a change in rotation in that backcourt, or guys that you think might have more pressure on them to to contribute and be productive early on without another guy in that group that's already played college basketball.
Yeah, I think the guy that it had the biggest effect on was Jamari McDowell, who, you know, I think he was someone who, when people are talking about possible red shirts over the course of the offseason, he was someone, along with Zach Clements, who you're like, well, maybe this would be a guy who they might redshirt. But now with Arterio no longer with the team for the reasons you alluded to, I think Jamari's going to have to step up a lot faster, because I think Elmarko is always going to be relied on for some sort of role. I mean, he's someone who people are talking about as a possible draft pick already, and he hasn't played in the game yet. Nick Timberlake's a sharp shooter, so he was going to play, regardless of if Arterio was here or not. But now Jamari's going to have to really help with those minutes, so that there's that depth on the perimeter that was definitely impacted with Arterio's dismissal.
What is Self talked about when it comes to Elmarko? He's kind of the headline of that recruiting class at this point, and when you look at a lot of lineup projections and start to kind of look at what the starting five might look like on opening night for Kansas, a lot of them, there's some Nick Timberlake in there, but there's also a lot of Elmarko starting in the backcourt with DeJuan Harris. Well, how is Bill Self talked about that freshman kind of heading into the season?
Yeah, I think, even yesterday during Kansas Media Day, Bill talked about him as sort of him reaching his potential is one of the most important things, if not the most important thing, for this group as it tries to reach the heights that it's going to try to reach this season. You mentioned Timberlake. Maybe Timberlake starts early on just because he's more of a veteran, experienced guy at the college level, and then they work on Marco to becoming a starter eventually. But I think whoever was on this team, I think eventually Marco was probably going to be a guy that was starting or at least playing starter minutes. So that doesn't change, but I think it's even more heightened now. And Bill is definitely talking about him as someone who's going to have a major, major role for his team, maybe akin to what Grady was a year ago, but obviously different types of players.
So you bring in, the big one is Hunter Dickinson. There's this long, drawn-out competition for his services in recruiting, one that ultimately ends up with him and Lawrence. He said at Big 12 Media Day that it's the best offensive, so, along the lines of one of the most talented offensive big men he's ever coached and had in the program. I'm curious, he's dominant in the way that McCormack was late in his career, the way that Azubuike was late in his career, but I think it's going to look different. He's just got a more advanced offensive skill set than those guys do, at least in my opinion. How do you think it's going to look different than the way you've seen Self use big men in the past? Right, his best teams have had really high level big men traditionally, but I feel like it could look different since Hunter's skill set is probably a little bit more advanced on the offensive end.
Yeah, I think the themes will probably be pretty similar. Like you alluded to, just, playing through a big man, especially like they were able to with McCormick on that run to national championships. I think the themes will be similar, but I think also, like you mentioned, there's just a skill set that Hunter brings, especially with his ability to step out and hit threes that Kansas hasn't had, at least in the recent past under Bill Self. So yeah, I think the themes will be similar in terms of what Bill wants to do in terms of how he's going to play with Juan in that team. But yeah, I think because, like you said, Hunter's offensive skill set's going to look a little different.
Do you think, and Josh and I have had conversations about the trajectory of Michigan's teams as Hunter's role got bigger and his voice in the locker room got louder, just from the perspective of he's been there longer, he's a veteran voice, rather than kind of being a really talented freshman on a Michigan team that has guys like Isaiah Livers and those type of players. Do you think he'll feel like one of the primary leaders of this team, or do you think that will more fall on the shoulders of guys like DeJuan Harris, Kevin McCullough Jr., guys that have been in this program for longer?
Yeah, I think Juan and Kevin and KJ to an extent can definitely be those, front guys, since they're three main returners. Juan and KJ both have national championships under their one national championship each under their belt. And Kevin's a long-standing member of the Big 12. So I think with those three there, he doesn't need to push it He can let that just come naturally. But I think given his just status as an All-American basketball player and being a senior and being, 7'2" center, I think there's going to be some leadership that comes his way, whether he sort of goes for it or not. But I think it can definitely come naturally, and there doesn't need to be any Hunter trying to force establishing himself. I think with his play and with the other three guys, like I mentioned, that can just come naturally.
I'm curious what you think about there won't be very many minutes where Hunter's not on the floor, and there certainly won't there, and even more so, there won't be very many minutes where at least him or KJ Adams aren't on the floor. When you look at the reserves in the front court, whether it's Parker Braun, Zach Clements, who do you think is the guy to kind of soak up some minutes when Hunter's not on the floor, foul trouble? Or are you concerned about front court depth in any way out after those two guys in the starting lineup?
The plan right now is that they're going to redshirt Zach Clements. That's their plan right now within the program after he came back from almost transferring out west. So I guess the guy that they're looking to be Hunter's backup would be Parker Brown, who's Christian Brown's brother, who won a national championship a couple years ago. So I think that's who they're looking for. Whether that happens, we'll see. But they definitely have KJ as an option as a backup 5-man if they want to go back to what they were playing last year, and obviously, winning a Big 12 title in the regular season. That was a pretty successful run that they had with KJ in there.
Gotcha. Let's take a look at the rest of this conference here. It's the beginning of what's going to be a transformative couple of years for the Big 12, right? We have this conference that this year is stacked with both the programs that are on their way out of the Big 12 and the teams that are entering the Big 12. So it's a conference that looks much more like the SEC there are 14 teams rather than my beloved double round robin true home and home conference schedule. The headline of that, of course, is Houston, the only other team in this conference that's top 10 in offensive and defensive efficiency preseason at KenPom. What are you expecting from Houston in year one? On the surface, it's a roster that looks very Big 12. It's a roster that looks like it's going to compete for possibly a Big 12 regular season title. What are you expecting from a Houston team that is obviously not like most quote unquote mid majors that enter a power conference ranking?
Yeah, I think like any team, like I think even you're seeing it in football where some of these new schools are sort of taking their lumps as they go through their first conference season. I think Houston, like any new team, I think there are going to be some moments in there where they probably take some lumps in Big 12 play. But I think, like you mentioned, with the roster they have, bringing in LJ Cryer from Baylor, I think it's still going to be a team that by the end of the season, you're going to see competing for the Big 12 title. I think they're a team that should be able to do that, and a team that could go on a Final Four run, much like Kansas or Baylor or Texas could this year as well. So, maybe some lumps here and there, but I mean, every team in the Big 12 takes their lumps at different points, as you've seen with Kansas the last couple of years, and they still won the Big 12. So it's not going to take them out of it. It's just a matter of if they can, and I'm pretty sure that they will be able to, take those lumps and move forward.
You mentioned LJ Cryer. I think it's really interesting. Last year, new to Houston, old to the Big 12, right? Coming from Baylor, 15 points a game last year, 41% from the 3-point line, and that's in a system that also featured a guy like Keontae George and other players that demanded the ball seems too aggressive, but certainly shared the scoring role with other guys there. It feels like the natural progression here is he's headed to Houston, and with Marcus Sasser, leaving for the NBA, that he kind of slides in there in the backcourt along with Jamal Shead, but as what will probably be like the 1A, if not the clear number one option for Kelvin Sampson in that offense. What do you think about even a bigger step forward for LJ Cryer? He's kind of the obvious first option for a team, arguably for the first time in his career.
Yeah, I think this is in a lot of ways about setting himself up for another run at trying at the NBA. I think much like you saw with Kevin transferring to Kansas to sort of change what his role, what he's showing. That was part of what Kevin's sort of plan of transferring to Kansas was. Now he's back for another year. I didn't follow LJ's recruitment all that closely, but it seems like that's an opportunity that he has at Houston to maybe evolve into a new role, new coaching staff, and then advance in a lot of ways. Like you said, probably is the main option um, there in Houston for a team that could potentially win a national championship. So I think just evolving his role is definitely possible, and probably what he envisioned when he transferred to Houston.
So on that list of incoming teams, you also have programs like BYU, Cincinnati, UCF, kind of filling the spectrum of programs in pretty solid positions and programs on the basketball front that are kind of in a rebuild mode. And you can go specific on the teams here if you'd like, but what do you think the impact of this bigger conference will be? Do you think it's going to feel a little more like a conference that, the thing about the Big 12 that's so attractive is, top to bottom, 1 through 10, most years, a lot of years, there were 10 teams that you could lose to, especially in their building, right? Or 9 teams, I suppose. Do you think that we'll start to see maybe just like those bottom 2 teams that are, they have a 4-16 type record just because those teams kind of find a way to the bottom in a conference this big? Or do you think we'll still see lots of really good teams kind of top to bottom?
Yeah, I think that kind of year is going to be more common. Almost certainly just, maybe some of these news teams do it. Maybe some of the teams that are, were a part of it altogether just has some down years. So I think it's more possible that'll happen. But I still think maybe UCF has maybe the toughest road on paper to being competitive in the Big 12 right now. But it seems like everyone still has a home environment that's going to be tough to play in any night. And then especially if you give UC, BYU, and UCF time to continue to develop, even when Texas and Oklahoma leave the Big 12, you're going to bring in some great basketball schools that were formerly in the Pac-12. So I think it'll still keep that energy of 1 through whatever, being, night in, night out. If you're going on the road, it's going to be a tough out. But I definitely think it's just math. It's going to be more common that some of those tough seasons are going to happen. Some teams are going to have down years, but I think still overall, it's still going to be the best basketball conference, at least by the metrics and everything in the country, for sure. I think for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, first KenPom preseason conference rankings, Big 12 is still right there, like it always is, first in those preseason rankings. I think you're right. It's not like, maybe on the football side of things, it's a little bit different, losing programs like Texas and Oklahoma. But, when you bring a team like Houston in, I mean, Houston's been more successful over the last 10 years than both Texas and Oklahoma. So I think that we're not in danger of losing the Big 12 as kind of the epitome of a college basketball conference and just kind of beating up on each other and having really great teams top to bottom. Elsewhere in the conference, right? We talked about Houston a little bit. Some of those other teams that seem like they're going to factor into the top half of this conference. Teams like Baylor, teams like Texas. Let's hop into Baylor here for just a second here. Lots of mid-major production is going to be leaned on, especially in the backcourt for Baylor and Scott Drew this year, right? You bring in, after losing guys like Adam Flagler, we talked about LJ Cryer, Keontae George. That's a lot of, that's like 45 points a game between those 3 guys. They were all in the 15 points per game kind of area. You bring in a guy like Ray J. Dennis. You bring in a guy like Jaden Nunn. Do you think that Baylor, assuming that those guys kind of translate, do you think Baylor has the ability, the ceiling to compete with the Houstons and Kansas of the world, or do you have them kind of in a tier below those 2 teams?
I guess I would say if there are tiers, I would put like Kansas and Houston maybe in the top, and then Baylor and Texas right below. But it'd be like such a small margin. Sure. I think Baylor Scott Drew has shown just how competitive they can be year to year. I don't think that's going anywhere. Mm-hmm. Obviously, when you're when you're taking guys who are going up from mid-major to high major, there's some risk in there to see if they can continue that production at a more consistent rate in tougher competition. But yeah, I have no doubts that Baylor, with the guys they brought in from the transfer portal, freshmen, everything, that they can be, a contender in the Big 12, or if they don't win the Big 12 regular season, a team that when the Big 12 tournament comes around is going to be just as capable as anyone is beating you in Kansas City.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, it's, I think there'll be maybe a little bit of a flip, the last, 4 or 5 years for Baylor. It feels like the conversation starts with the backcourt, whether it's, you're going back to the national championship team and guys like Davion Mitchell and Jared Butler and guys like that. And then last year it was, the names that I mentioned, Flagler, George, and Cryer. The continuity in the program this year is in that front court, right? With guys like Jalen Bridges, who's been there before, Jonathan Chamba-Chachua, who had a tumultuous year last year, starting with injury, and never really felt like he was back in the way that he had been in years prior. And hopefully we get a little bit of that this year. But I feel like that Baylor might have a little bit of a different feel just because of where that kind of veteran presence might be leaned on this year. I think it's interesting that when you look at the top of this conference, you have a Kansas team that of course has, you have your DeJuan Harris kind of leading the way it's hard to find a more solid guard in the country than DeJuan. And then at Houston, you have a guy in LJ Cryer and a guy in Jamal Shed, who is technically coming into a high major conference for the first time, but Jamal Shed, no one's worried about Jamal Shed being able to handle the Big 12. Then those next, 2 or 3 teams, depending on how you feel about Kansas State, kind of leaning on some mid-major guards and guards that can score the basketball a lot, kind of coming into the fold into the Big 12. And at Kansas State, it's Tyler Perry coming over from North Texas. At Texas, of course, it's Max Asmus, and then we just talked about the backcourt here at Baylor. Do you think that there's a chance that the hierarchy of the Big 12 just kind of comes down to the fact that 2 of those teams have Big 12 level proven guards and those other 3 don't? Could it possibly just be that simple at the end of the day?
Yeah, I guess, but I think I would also, given just the caliber that these mid-major guards who are coming into the Big 12 new have seemed to sort of gather just from the sort of the scouting just world, how highly some of these guys are regarded. I would say that I'd still give them a shot to see, if that develops over time. So it could end up being that simple, just like how it seems now just the most experienced teams are the teams that are, going to be successful in the end, comparatively if you just have a ton of younger new guys. At least that's just sort of what it seems to be the narrative now in college basketball. But I think given how well the people who are revered in scouting have considered these newcomers to be, I think I'd give them a shot. And then if they don't get it, then they don't get it. But I seem to have faith in them for now, at least.
Yeah, they're definitely not. They're not your typical. They're not normal mid-major guard transfers, right? I mean, Asmus has been doing it for ever. I mean, we go back to the COVID year and him and that Oral Roberts team doing what they did to Ohio State in the NCAA tournament. I on that Texas front, I guess year 1.5 for Rodney Terry, but year 1 of this is your program. This is a team that you put together in the offseason. What do you make of the first full year of Rodney Terry? Do you think, and do you attribute a lot of the Texas had a really solid and strong into the season? Do you think that was a lot of Rodney Terry, or kind of Rodney just being able to guide a ship that Chris Beard had built before he left the program? How do you feel about Texas heading into the season?
Yeah, no, I still think that they're a team that can contend for the Big 12 right there with Baylor if things go quickly. I think it says a lot about what Rodney and that team were able to do, that they could stick together and not fold when something as tumultuous as what happened there happened. on I guess really a couple different fronts. But I still so yeah, I think maybe there's some aspect of that run that's they were bonding together, them against the world kind of mentality to go on that run to the Elite Eight, win a Big 12 tournament, really come close to winning the Big 12 regular season. If that season had gone on for much longer, maybe they would have been able to catch Kansas. But um, yeah, I still think I'm pretty high on them. It's going to be interesting to see, how that backcourt develops. See how Tyrese Hunter, I think I got that right. Yeah, Tyrese Hunter does in year two after transferring from Iowa State. But if they can gel like the way that Rodney Terry seemed to get them to when he took over, then I think they're definitely capable of winning night in, night out, really anywhere they play.
Yeah, I think the most impressive part of, as you mentioned, was it would have been easy for them to kind of peter out, to fall apart to a certain extent, but it almost felt like there was some. It felt like they got stronger as that year progressed after Terry took over, and I think if nothing else, that's a testament to the leadership and being able to bring a group of guys together, which is arguably the best quality that a college basketball coach can have nowadays, with how much roster turnover there is. Moving to the conference, kind of as a whole, some overarching stuff. We talked a little bit about it earlier, but do you think, this is always a conference that 10 teams, you could get 7 in the tournament, and it's not outlandish to suggest that all 10 have a chance, that it could shake out in some way, that all 10 have the chance. Do you think the NCAA tournament depth is there this year? We've talked a lot about the top of the conference, but you can go pretty deep here into the middle of it and get to teams like TCU, Iowa State, BYU, even Texas Tech, that on paper can have a shot to make the NCAA tournament. Do you think that depth will continue this year?
Yeah, I think that depth will still be there. I think they'll still be able to get the same about number of teams that they've been getting in recent years into the tournament. I think they have enough talent in this league, even with all really the seeming roster turnover that's happened in a lot of different places. There's the talent where they can keep that going. Just the graphics at the end are going to be a little different. The percentages aren't going to be as high. Sure. And so the Big 12, I'm sure, will be just fine with that if they can just use the number of teams in the tournament. So, yeah, just the percentage will go down, but I don't see any reason why the sort of numbers-wise that they've been doing over the years, I don't see why that would have to change. And it might even help out in some ways having, more teams. Maybe some of the schedules work out so some teams aren't tested as much as they would be in the double round robin format. So some teams can have some years maybe they wouldn't otherwise. But, I don't think that's going to go anywhere.
Is there any team that you think has the potential to surprise some people, whether that's kind of being in the upper half when people aren't expecting that, or even pushing, kind of being in position to win a conference regular season once we get to late January, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think Texas Tech is a team that I'm watching pretty closely. Just Grant and Caslin had a lot of success at North Texas. I believe actually when Kansas played in the ESPN Events Invitational in Florida a couple years ago, I think North Texas was there. So I'm pretty sure I saw them in person when Grant was still there, and I was impressed by what they were doing a couple years ago. So I think Texas Tech, even with all the roster reconstruction they've been doing, is still a team that can be pretty dangerous if Grant has the success he had at North Texas. If you can kick those tires pretty quickly there in Lubbock, and that's a really impressive home environment when it's full. So I think with all of those sort of confluence of factors, that's a team that can be really dangerous. And then I guess I was also thinking TCU when you asked that, but they also are have been pretty good. So I don't and they're not dealing with the coaching change. So I guess I don't really put them in the same group as Texas Tech in that way.
Yeah, TCU is an interesting one for me, just because it's one of those teams that the departures jump off the page before any of the newcomers, because guys like Mike Miles Jr., like Damian Ball, Eddie Lampkin, those are just names that we've associated with TCU, what feels like for quite a while. But you start to break down those newcomers, and it's there's quite a bit to be to be confident in, whether it's Jameer Nelson Jr., another mid-major guy that's a walking bucket at the guard position, and their front court and kind of wing personnel this year I think is really intriguing because of they just have so much depth there. I'm really intrigued by what they can put on the floor this season too. Last thing before I let you get out of here, do you think that Kansas is the only, whether it's when we get to the tournament or later in the year, do you think that Kansas is the team that will be like right there in the national title conversation, or could Houston, could Baylor? Do you think that those teams have that kind of ceiling, or would you be a little bit surprised if those teams are really, really right there with Kansas as we get kind of pushing towards the tournament and people really starting to talk about, okay, who are the teams on the short list of national title contenders?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't be surprised if teams like that are right there with Kansas. I think Kansas could definitely be a team if they stay healthy that's at the forefront of everything the whole season long, just because of the talent they have, like we've mentioned and alluded to. I mean, they have a freshman who made the preseason top 20 for one of those whatever the small forward award is. I can't remember off the top of my head, but so Kansas has a lot of talent. I think if they stay healthy, they'll be right there. But because these other teams might eventually have more depth than Kansas, just sheer numbers wise, I think that could help them stay right there with Kansas and maybe keep Kansas from, pulling away in the way that they might have otherwise if they had more depth numbers wise. So no, I wouldn't be surprised if those teams are right there with Kansas, or if there are times this season when Kansas is a little behind them and then Kansas sort of gets it going again as things, head up toward March.
Jordan, appreciate you hopping on the podcast to talk some Kansas hoops with us, some Big 12. Good luck with all your coverage heading into this season. I appreciate the time.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man.
Jordan, thank you so much for the time. We did it. That's 12 previews, conference-specific previews, getting you ready for the college basketball season. Next week, we will have a couple of awards, bold predictions type of pods to put a stamp on the preview series. And then we got games. Right now it's October 26th. We got games in like 10 days. I cannot wait. November 6th is the beginning of the college basketball season. Cannot wait. And we appreciate all of the support on YouTube and on the pod in this preview series. We hope you will stick around. We have some new format stuff coming. More podcasts, and even more digestible. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll announce more about that in the next few days as we lead up to the beginning of the season. But for now, that's all I've got for you. Please subscribe to the Jays for Days podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Follow us on Twitter at Jays for Days Pod. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's free, and I would be very appreciative if you hit that red button. Thank you so much for listening to this edition of the Jays for Days podcast. I'm Josh. He's Josh. He's not Josh. He wasn't here, but he's still Josh. He'll be back. And we'll see you later.